to start into the programme, our first topic is what is Dublin? And I would like to introduce Dr. Ruth McManus from DCU. Now, Ruth received a letter like you did, and Ruth put her hand up like you did to volunteer her services to serve a purpose higher than herself, Dublin City and County. Unfortunately, Ruth wasn't selected like you were, but she's been given the opportunity today to come talk to us about the geography of Dublin. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Ruth McManus from DCU.
Good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to have got my opportunity to come here, even if I didn't get the magic letter. My brief is to talk on the topic of what is Dublin and why does it look and feel the way it does. It's a very big topic for a short presentation on a Saturday morning, but I'll do my best to give you this big picture view of Dublin from my viewpoint, which is that of a geographer. So from a geographer's perspective, the first thing to say is that there's no single definition that we can use to describe Dublin. And each and every one of you in this room will have a different view of the city and the county, depending on where we come from, what our own unique experiences have been. All of these things will shape our Dublin, the Dublin of the imagination. So if you were to ask me about my Dublin, I'd begin by telling you that I'm a Northsider, that I'm probably not a true Dub because my parents are both Colchis, and that I may have been born in Holles Street, but I support the Mayo football team. Sorry, Jim. Nevertheless, I've been studying the city and particularly its suburban evolution for many years. But my identity as a Dubliner and my understanding of the city and county is shaped by many different factors, and the same goes for each and every one of you. As individuals, we all have multiple identities. It depends on the time and the place, depends on who's asking the question. You'll describe yourself in different ways. You're not one single dimension. You're not just a postman or a footballer or a parent or a brilliant cook. You can be all of those things simultaneously. And in the same way that we all have multiple identities, Dublin also has many different facets, and these go far beyond that sort of objective definition that you might find in an encyclopedia. So over the next few minutes, I'd like to think through some of the different facets that contribute to this complex entity, which is modern Dublin. This is simply a starting point, just some ideas to start the process of thinking about what Dublin is, why it is the way it is, and how it might be in the future. So I don't claim to have any answers, really. My role is simply to set the scene, and particularly from my view as a historical geographer. So this view of Dublin seen from space is a really important starting point, because from this perspective we can see Dublin in its physical setting. We can get a sense of its scale. Although this image clearly shows the human impact on the landscape, it's also a view which is unencumbered by the boundary lines that feature on maps of the city and county, which are of course imposed by humans. And it's also a reminder of the beautiful hinterland of Dublin, the natural hinterland, the mountains, the bay, with its importance as a biosphere reserve. So although our focus is largely on Dublin from a human perspective, we should also acknowledge the non-human environment and its significance. Dublin exists as a settlement because of the particular attributes of its location. I have to say that I'm a geographer. It grew up on the shores of Dublin Bay, along the banks of the River Liffey, at a crossing point of ancient routeways. And those attributes made it an important point of access, and later one of the most important ports of Viking Europe. This relative location of Dublin on the island also meant that it would become a natural focal point for governing Ireland when the Anglo-Normans made their presence felt in the late 12th century. So from this time onwards, Dublin would take on a new importance within the governance structures of colonial Ireland. And Dublin Castle would take on a symbolic importance as a locus of power, which it has retained ever since. The way Dublin itself was organised and governed has also changed from this time on. So Dublin Corporation was established in 1192. The city government and its organisational structure retained that name until 2002, when it was renamed Dublin City Council. But many older Dubliners, myself included, still refer to the Corpo. And the office of the mayor was created a little bit later in 1229. So we have a very ancient structure. I'm not going to talk any more about that. That's for later on. But for much of its existence, Dublin was a very small, compact city. Even in the 17th century. This is Speed's map. I have to include a map again, geographer. It shows us a town which is still most densely occupied within its walls. I don't know if you can see out as far to the east as Trinity College out there in the marshlands, well outside the city. It was a trading port. It was an administrative centre. There was some industry, particularly in the Liberties. But it's really in the late 17th and 18th centuries that the Dublin we know today starts to evolve. The tourist Dublin, Georgian Dublin. Dublin experienced something of golden age. The old medieval town was reshaped into a more modern capital. And land was developed, particularly to the east of the older town. Private landlords laid out new streets and squares. These attractive areas of Georgian Dublin came into existence. Property speculation, fueled by the wealth of the countryside. So again, we need to think of these property elites within the context of Dublin's broader hinterland. And in order to reflect its power and prestige, the city was also being remade through the powers of the Wide Streets Commissioners, who created these wide, straight streets and new bridges to facilitate access, and many new public buildings were also erected, including the Parliament, the forecourts, the Custom House. So, like all cities, Dublin was constantly made and remaking itself throughout history. It was also shaped and has been shaped by forces outside of its control. So the 19th century saw Dublin losing its parliament because of the Act of Union. It lost political power to a degree. It also lost economic strength and vitality. So Guinness, the breweries, the distilleries like this one, and Jacob's Biscuits are kind of relatively exceptional to that. So Dublin's economy struggled in the 19th century. And yet, the city was constantly experiencing in-migration from the countryside, typically impoverished labouring poor, throwing themselves on the mercy of the city and its many charitable organisations. So these structural changes in politics, in economy and in society were reflected in the built environment. And most of you will probably be familiar with the story of the tenements of Dublin. So the beautiful houses that we saw in the Malton print were subdivided into multiple family homes for poorer people in Dublin. So people cramming themselves into poor housing. And these notorious tenements really became emblematic of dear, dirty Dublin. But not everybody who lived in Dublin was experiencing those sort of poor conditions in the 19th century. The better off were inspired by the new fashion for suburban living. Instead of staying in the terraced townhouses that had been popular in the previous centuries, the well-to-do moved out to new suburban villas. They had access to more space, to fresh air, to more pleasant surroundings beyond the dirty and overcrowded city. The process of suburbanisation begins in Dublin in the 19th century. It takes off in the 20th century, and it's one of the leading factors which shaped the city that we know today. It might seem strange for me to say that, but many of the city's current challenges can be traced back to problems which originated nearly 200 years ago and the attempts that were made to solve those problems. Now, when the middle classes left Dublin in the 19th century to the new suburbs like Rathmines, like Ballsbridge, Clontarf, later Drumcondra, they weren't just moving to what they perceived to be more attractive locations, they were also leaving the jurisdiction of the city authorities. So on this map, the very centre, the circle at the centre, sort of purpley colour, is the Dublin Corporation area. And all of the other colours are separate independently governed entities. So by crossing the canal bridges, these residents crossed a boundary. They moved outside of the area controlled by the corporation into independently governed townships. All of these had their own systems of representation, their own services, water, sewage, even fire brigades, their own town halls, and most importantly, their own local taxation system. So Dublin was fragmented. Areas that we would consider in the present day to be really inner city areas nearly, were left to their own devices. They ran their own services. And rather than seeing coherent decisions being made for the city as a whole, the fragmentation of urban governance led to ongoing challenges. Similar issues persist around city boundaries to the present. And in the meantime, the corporation was left with the needs of this impoverished population living in the crumbling tenements. The better off were living outside the boundaries, paying their local taxes elsewhere, so it was hard to get the money to deal with the problem. It's said that these problems directly influenced the shaping of the modern city. That's for a number of reasons. First, the perceived solution to the tenement problem was to build suburban housing for the working classes. There was a lot of debate about where to house people, but people were distrustful of flats. The experience of the tenements of multiple occupancy was a very negative one, and the relatively higher densities, the higher death rates, and so on. So building on greenfield sites at low densities, 12 houses to the acre, that's 30 to the hectare, that was considered to be desirable, giving everyone a garden front and rear, their own front door, and from the 20s onwards, an opportunity to own their own homes. So these new areas were developed in the 20s, the 30s, 40s, 50s and beyond. They're the neighbourhoods that many of us identify with today. If I asked you where you're from, would you say you're from Dublin, or would you say you're from Crumlin or Cabra or Tain, Ballyfermot, Castleknock? These urban villages are an important element of the lived experience of the city. Until the 50s then, flats were generally only built by local authorities. People were living in semi-detached or terraced houses, low density. That was the established norm. And these new schemes, built during the 20th century by the corporation and by private developers, were generally welcomed by their new occupants. And there were many new occupants. Right through the 20th century, even though Ireland as a whole was actually losing population right through mass emigration. 1961, we only had 2.8 million people living in the whole of Ireland. The city of Dublin continued to be a magnet to people moving in from the countryside. So this is the Dublin that my parents came to in the 1960s. It was in search of employment. It was the largest city, the location of government, civil service offices, company headquarters, and it had this prime position in the urban hierarchy. That's something that has persisted and intensified. So Dublin is a primate city, like London or Paris. It's disproportionately impactful on the national stage. And it also continues to attract population. Now it's not just from the rest of Ireland, but it's internationally as well. I mentioned the impacts of suburbanisation. If we think about building large estates of housing at a density of, say, 12 to the acre, it's going to use up a lot of ground very quickly. So the rich market gardening land of North County Dublin, we passed through probably on the way to get here today, gradually started to give way to crops of houses. And the same was the case right around the county as the 20th century wore on. Once people start to suburbanise and live in these suburban areas, so too did jobs and services. So industries which had once located in the city began to relocate, sometimes to new suburban industrial estates, maybe overseas to areas where there were cheaper labour forces. That's also a time in the 70s and 80s of deindustrialisation and new types of employment and service industries coming in. So it's not replacing the manufacturing jobs, it's a new type of employment. And of course, when you have people living in suburbs and working in suburbs, you start to get really complex commuting patterns. You don't have everybody coming into town to the city centre. So radial, typical spokes of a wheel that we have our public transport doesn't really work if you have people moving between different suburbs. So it's very complex. And of course, shopping also began to suburbanise. In the late 60s, we had our very first suburban shopping centre in Ireland at Stillorgan. And this happens to be Stillorgan. I chose this image because the shopping centre is somewhere there in the middle. There's lots of car parking. And then we have all of these separate housing estates. They're sort of not really linked to each other. You can almost see where the lines were drawn between the different fields. They don't connect together. In the late 60s, we have the first of the suburban shopping centres. By the 90s, we see regional level centres being planned around or close to the M50 ring, Blanchardstown, Liffey Valley, Tallaght, Dundrum, and people increasingly depending on cars to access these places. It's almost inevitable. So people began to turn their backs on a city centre that was hollowed out, a location that was perceived as being less attractive, more congested, less accessible. If we want to get a really good sense of that shift in population, the impact it had, consider this. In 1926, 2/3 of Dublin's population was living within the central area defined by the canals and the North Circular Road. 2/3 of the whole population. By 1986, fewer than 1 in 12 people were living within that area. So Dublin had spread out and de-intensified, if you like. Now, that changed to a degree with urban renewal policies, and people did begin to live in apartments in the city centre from the 90s. But in spite of those changes, Dublin had already moved on a particular trajectory. And it's one which we see as a much more complex one. So on the one hand, Dublin continued to intensify its magnetic pull, a focal point for population and for economic growth. But on the other hand, that population and economic strength was being physically dispersed across a much greater area, spreading well beyond the formal boundaries into an ever-increasing hinterland. So I put this up to give you an idea of what starts to happen along the M50, this ring road, from the 90s on. It leads to the creation of what geographers term an edge city. So you have right at the edge of the city, along this road that's supposed to encircle the city, you start to see the development of all sorts of warehousing, business parks, housing for people as well, warehouses, all sorts. A new city being created at the edge. But the city centre also starts to compete internationally to attract corporate headquarters and tech companies. And what we see then in the city is a sometimes anonymous architecture of the IFSC in the Silicon Docks area, reflecting a globalised, footloose industry and the expectations of its digital nomads. So we create spaces that don't really seem to be specific to Dublin, but increasingly feel that they could be anywhere. None of these processes are unique to Dublin. This changing relationship between city and hinterland, the position of the city within its national, international, and ultimately globalised economic context, they're all processes that we can see across the Western world over the same time frame. Okay, so coming to a conclusion here. We've seen that Dublin has grown. It's grown from this tiny little compact town to an increasingly large and complex metropolis. This is one of my students did this. I actually forgot this was going to start animating itself. But if you can see this, the map that shows us, this is what Dublin was like up to 1940. It's still pretty small, and now it has just spread outwards and outwards. So it's always been a challenge to match the boundaries to the extent of the city. So what we've seen is that Dublin has been constantly growing. It's continued to be a magnet for people, for ideas, for money, and for power. It's a primate city. It's by far the largest within the Irish urban network. And its influence has expanded far beyond its formal administrative boundaries over the course of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So the continuous built-up area and the wider hinterland within the orbit of the capital city has extended well into neighbouring counties and even further. The geographical impacts are enormous. They cause challenges not just for the city, but also for those areas. I think that's what caused our problem. We're going to see if we can. I think that just crashed everything. It was too much at this hour of the morning. So it has extended so far, but the geographical impacts are enormous. They cause challenges not just for the city, but also for those areas beyond the city which are increasingly under its influence. I've described an urban trajectory without commenting directly on the sustainability of Dublin's development. But we do need to think about what makes a sustainable city into the future. And that means the three pillars of sustainability: economy, society, and environment. We've seen that Dublin, like all cities, is constantly changing, and it always has done. And that change has been influenced by many factors, often beyond the control of the city and its people. It could be natural forces or external influences like colonialism, or more recently, economic globalization, the diktats of foreign direct investment. Power and economic wealth have often dominated those changes. From the influential 18th century families, the Gardners, the Fitzwilliams, still names that we know from the streets of our city today, to large multinational corporations. But this Citizens' Assembly offers a rare opportunity for you as citizens, without such vested interests, to take a step back and to consider how our city might be shaped into the future. I began by pointing to the multiple identities of Dublin, its different meanings for different people. A few of us really see this complex structure that is Dublin on a daily basis. For most of us, it's a city of villages and neighbourhoods, a place where we live, where we work, where we play. And most of us want to encourage and promote those aspects of Dublin which make it a unique place full of character. In trying to understand the evolution of the city to what it is today, I've inevitably focused primarily on economic and societal factors which have been key influences. But we shouldn't forget that our decisions impact on all those who live here, human and non-human. Okay, this is the last slide. We've zoomed back out to look once again at the entirety of this space, of our corner of the world. I've deliberately oriented or not oriented this final image in the usual north-south direction, because that's a last reminder to us of the need to look at Dublin differently, to challenge our preconceptions. This assembly is offering us, the citizens, an exciting opportunity to consider how to shape it for the future, to create the best possible lived experience for all of its occupants. So I wish you every luck in this important work. Thank you.